Hello and welcome to Roddy Reviews, and today it's time to talk about the 80s, or the 90s, or any movie that basically tackles a group of kids going out on their 10 speeds and just wreaking havoc or going on adventures for the sake of nostalgia. You see, I just watched the 2022 new VOD release, the follow-up for B. Harrison Smith to the special, Where the Scary Things Are. So this is going to be kind of a review of that mixed in with a little bit of a rant about this new trend. Stranger Things Season 4 just wrapped up, which, whew, good stuff there. But, movies and TV shows have been trying to kind of capture this lightning in a bottle for a little while now, and it's something that I think needs to be talked about, needs to be addressed, because so often it gets it wrong. So, Where the Scary Things Are, written and directed by B. Harrison Smith. This movie follows a group of teenagers or kids that basically want to have a little bit of a hideout, an area that they can call their own, that they can hang out in and just be themselves. And for them in particular, it happens to be at an off-season haunted attraction, a theme park area centered around haunted houses and so forth, monsters, ghouls, what have you. And it's not open to the public. They are getting shooed off by security, having their parents called, things like that. But nevertheless, they still insist that that is where they want their hangout to be. And things kind of get shaken up when they receive an assignment from their teacher at school about how propaganda and rumors and urban legends are spread, so they are tasked with writing and creating their own urban legend for the sake of a social experiment and seeing how fast this kind of thing can spread. And it just so happens that this simultaneously occurs along with them finding an actual monster, which they chain up, weaponize, and turn into their project. So just shelving the nostalgia conversation for the moment and just approaching this movie, I found this to be a terrible watch. I really couldn't stand it in the slightest. And that was kind of interesting because it was fairly competently done. I actually enjoyed B. Harrison Smith's previous horror film of The Special. To a limited degree. It was kind of a gross out body horror, interesting kind of thought experiment with a fairly absurd premise on its face. But I did enjoy it for what it was, and watching the main character of Jerry go down a rabbit hole and spiral through this addiction was an interesting kind of aspect of things. And as far as Where the Scary Things Are goes, I think the biggest problem with that kind of comes to the natural evolution of where we were at with the characters in the special. You see, in the special, we had somewhat unlikable characters, especially the main character of Jerry, as we do watch him, as I mentioned before, spiral and go down this rabbit hole. And it was just an interesting premise, having this silly situation, beat this character down, drive him into the ground, and just see how far he can fall. Whereas with Where the Scary Things Are, all of the characters are not just unlikable, they are absolutely detestable. I hated them, and I am extremely careful with that word. I don't use it flippantly. I hated all of the characters in this except for one. And this wasn't just teenagers with good hearts causing mischief and mayhem in the name of adventure. These were absolute terrible people causing all sorts of pain. We had one character who loves his camera and is trying to get a channel monetized and blow up on the YouTubers. And to do this, he's like hiring bums to fight. And I remember the days of bum fights. It was always treated as one of the worst aspects of humanity with a camera held up to it. And the fact that this kid is doing that, not to mention this entire group of kids, is basically bonded with this idea of docking people, which is essentially, following somebody, investigating them, finding blackmail, and finding ways to hold that over them and extort victims. The good old fun stuff that we used to do, riding our bikes and skinning our knees and extorting people and paying bums $20 to wail on each other. So when the idea of this monster shows up and everything, when they do find a way to kind of restrain it and weaponize it and turn it into their project, of course, they find ways to turn into even bigger assholes and show the worst side of themselves, continue to go down the same kind of rabbit hole thing. But at no point did I really feel any connection with any of them. I just hated them. The monster itself, the special effects, the cinematography, the sound design, the music, all that was actually fairly competent, as well as even the acting and performances sometimes were cringeworthy, but hey, when were we not cringeworthy as kids and preteens? It happens. But this one aspect of things was such a blight that I really just could not overlook it. I could not get into the movie. I couldn't find myself in any way, shape, or form enjoying the watch. They were just miserable people, and I wanted the film to end. The one exception to this was the character of their teacher, Mr. Brent Lewis, played by 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺. And I remember 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺 was in the special as a detective hot on Jerry's heels, just kind of there for the stakes of things. And I remember that I particularly enjoyed his performance. For a character that was basically inserted into the movie for simply no other reason than having stakes nip at the heels of the main character as he's spiraling, I thought that 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺 actually brought a lot of depth and humanity to it, way more than the character itself deserved. And I found that that was actually the case here too. For a teacher that was, just trying to show a curriculum and show these kids what urban legends can do and so forth, I actually thought that 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺's performance of this went well above and beyond the actual emotional resonance that the character called for, and I found it to be one of the standout aspects of this movie. I would actually think that 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺 is definitely an actor to watch for. I think that he has a lot to bring to the table, and I really do hope that he blows up. But beyond that, I found this to be a reprehensible, boring, and extraordinarily difficult movie to engage with, and I cannot really recommend it. I can't even think of a demographic that I could recommend this to. I don't want to say nobody should watch this movie, but I, for the life of me, can't think of any group of people that I would say, this is one for you. So let's get into the nostalgia thing, because this movie kind of keeps a somewhat sort of vague timeline-ish. It's not set in the 80s. I mean, we have a character that's trying to get his channel monetized, but it kind of alludes to a lot of that kind of spirit. We have the scamps and the teenagers trying to get into mischief and so forth. We have cutesy names for a lot of them, like Snack and Mighty and Scribble. It draws from a lot of inspiration of things like The Goonies, E.T., things like that, as well as a lot of other movies are falling under that umbrella. We had Summer of '84 come up, and there's definitely been others that are trying to get in on that nostalgia factor. And I kind of like what Don Draper said about nostalgia in his Kodak pitch in Mad Men, where he called it delicate but potent. And I have to agree with that. I think that it can be potent. It calls to us. It speaks to us as far as, our childhoods or a time of the past that we consider to be, an element of resonance and something that we're fond of and almost wish we can go back to. I like the idea of nostalgia being something that is almost melancholy. The idea of we can never go home again, in my experience, in my life, has always held true. Anytime I have tried to revisit the past, it's always been met with a little bit of I didn't realize it was quite like that, and things have changed, and now they're kind of sadder. And I've never actually called back to past recollections with a complete overall beneficial experience. It's always been bittersweet. So yeah, it does need to be treated very delicately, and if it is, it can also be quite potent. And I think that Stranger Things has dealt with that fairly well. Yes, it does have its anachronisms, and yes, it does have its issues with just kind of beating the drum just a little bit too hard occasionally, but overall, I think the thing that has made it work is the same thing that has made movies like Goonies and E.T. and so forth work, and that is a sense of wonderment. It is lightning in a bottle, and it is a difficult thing to kind of, put your finger on the pulse of on any technical level, on any writing level. It's that kind of mysterious word element, wondrous. Well, how do you inject wondrous into your movie? It's a delicate balance, and not everybody gets it right. In fact, very few do. I remember watching the director's commentary of The Goonies, and the kids, now adults, were talking about Richard Donner as he was on set, and, the one instruction that they were constantly being given was big eyes. Big eyes, big eyes. Every time the camera's on them, big eyes. No matter what's happening, there's always got to be that sense of wonderment in the characters. And yes, they don't always have to be the best people. They have to have some level of mischief. There has to be some level of conflict. But at the same time, there also does have to be a certain amount of heart within the movie. And in that, with having these characters be our protagonists, there has to be some level of heart imbued within them. I remember just watching recently the movie Cloak and Dagger, and watching Henry Thomas nail it in both E.T. and Cloak and Dagger with the amount of heart and wonderment he brought to the roles of both was just astounding. And that's one thing that has been extraordinarily lacking in these movies that have been trying to take over the world of nostalgia, but doing so in a haphazard way and forgetting what made those movies great to begin with. It wasn't the fact that they were set in the 80s. A lot of movies were set in the 80s. Especially around the 80s. That didn't make them inherently great. But having characters that we can identify with and rally behind and almost feel like we want to be a part of their group and a part of their camp and get into those mischievous situations with them as they encounter a constant barrage of wonderment, well, that was just resonance in the time. And by calling back to the past, we also establish a resonance with that time. So we establish not only that connection to the film and to the characters, but also to ourselves in the world that we used to inhabit. And that, above anything else, is why it is so difficult, so delicate, and so potent. I think one movie that almost got it right, but not entirely, was a movie that also kind of took the concept and turned it into a dissection and turned a mirror onto itself, was the movie Summer of '84. We had that kind of nostalgic factor with the characters, having a buddy-buddy relationship and riding their bikes down the street and getting into mischief and mayhem as they're investigating their neighbor. But at the same time, things felt a bit colder, felt a bit darker. That sense of wonderment wasn't quite there. But that movie was largely saved by the fact that it kind of flipped the script a little bit, and not only did the ending, which I won't spoil, really hammer things home in a way that was absolutely massively dreadful and impactful, it also wound up in a place where it kind of spoke to that nostalgic factor, saying, yeah, a lot of movies did have rose-colored glasses, and we're going to show you what the world looked like without that tint. It's a little bit colder, it's a little bit harsher, and it doesn't always have a happy ending. And I dug that a lot. I found a movie that was able to kind of tap into that resource in one hand, and then in the other also kind of eviscerate it. It was a unique experience, and it wasn't well received by everybody, but I personally did enjoy it. Again, when you dabble in the nostalgia factor, it becomes a delicate balance, and when you turn it on its head, it's not always going to be received well. It took me a little while to appreciate that movie for what it was, rather than the movie that I wanted it to be based on the first half hour of runtime. So as far as this trend goes, I'm kind of two minds about it. On one hand, I dig it. I like the idea of this. I like kind of, scratching that itch and having that emotional resonance imbued within a film that takes me back to my childhood and takes me back to that wonderment. But on the other hand, it needs to be done well, and it needs to be treated with the reverence that it deserves. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat on its face, and having cutesy names attached to your characters as they're riding bikes down the street like Snack and Mighty and Scribble doesn't mean jack shit if you're going to strip the wonderment out of the movie and turn them into reprehensible, hateful, asshole characters that nobody can rally behind and make your movie unwatchable. So that's my review of Where the Scary Things Are. What's your thoughts on this? I'd be interested to hear from you. Leave your comments below. If you like this, please click like and subscribe. And if you want to support me creating future videos and so forth, you can either leave a super thanks or consider joining the Patreon. We have all sorts of benefits, watch party, Discord, weekly vlogs, all sorts of good stuff. And the lowest tier starts at only $1 a month. So remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.